This is not an official podcast of the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution, NSDAR, and does not necessarily represent the position of the NSDAR. This episode is a continuation from part 1, during which Adrienne Abiodun began to talk about the lies that she discovered on her grandfather's birth certificate.
Because I said his birth certificate is a hot mess. Like there's lies. There's lies on the record. I said, this is going to be problematic. I said, but I do have DNA and that will help, to provide credibility to who my grandfather really is the son of.
What type of lies were on his records?
Okay. Yeah, I'll break it down. So again, I just mentioned my grandfather was born in segregated Mississippi in 1924. His birth certificate states that his father was a man named Tom Wilson, who was a black railroad hand, and his mother's information was correct. Her name is Minerva Jones, and she was a black woman. But that was not true. And everyone in the community knew who he was the son of, and people, even to this day, refer to him like, isn't he a Moffett? So my grandfather's biological father was really a man by the name of James Moffett. And James Moffett was a chancery clerk. He owned a nightclub or night spot that for Negroes. And he kind of had fun with some of the women patrons. And that resulted in the birth of my grandfather, the birth of a half-sister of his, and who knows who else. But his name was not going to go on to a birth record. So that was an issue. That was going to be my biggest hurdle for applying to the Daughters of the American Revolution, because how do I prove that my grandfather is really the son of this James Moffett and not a Wilson?
And James Moffett, was he a descendant of your Revolutionary War patriot? And which
Correct.
Patriot?
He was. James Moffett was is a descendant of my Revolutionary War patriots, and the ones that I've identified were Christopher Guise, James Collins, and Samuel Layton.
He was a descendant of which of those?
All three.
How are they all related?
Okay. So my grandfather's father, James Moffett, was the son of a Thomas Moffett and a Mamie Alice Bedford. But on his maternal side, the Bedford side, that side leads to the Guise family and that patriot. But I couldn't join DAR. Not only was my grandfather's issue of paternity a problem on that particular line, the further I went back on the Guise line, I have an ancestor, Matilda Guise Bedford, and I could not connect her to her father, David Guise. So that was like strike one. I was like, okay, got to find a different patriot, which wasn't hard. I ended up going through the Layton line, and the Layton line is also on my grandfather's father's maternal side. So on my grandfather's grandmother, her name was Mary Alice Mamie Bedford. She was the daughter of an Anna Layton, and Anna was the daughter of George Layton, who was the grandson of my patriot ancestor. George had come out of Massachusetts down into Mississippi and married a woman by the name of Sarah Ledbetter. And as the oral history I'm told goes, the family back in Massachusetts wrote him off because he married into a lands family, which meant he married a wealthy family that owned a lot of slaves or enslaved a lot of people. So the family back in Massachusetts apparently wrote him off, like you don't exist anymore to us, which I found that to be a quite interesting oral history. So when I heard that really like perked my ears up and got me a little bit more interested in researching this family, because if I have to be quite honest, I not really had a lot of interest in my European lineage or heritage. And that comes from shame and generational shame, I guess I would say. It comes from anger and pain and just not really being embraced by that particular side. So it's not a place of celebration, I would say, among my family members. It's not this place of let's go find out and about that side, or let's go, delight in this. A lot of my family were enslavers. They weren't small slave owners. They didn't own just one person. They owned 44 or 100. And so that wasn't a space of celebration coming from my immediate family, which had these deep Southern roots. But when I heard that story about George Layton and the family saying, no, that's not allowed, we don't like it, I wanted to know more. Who are they? Why? Why did they say that? What would compel them to not like it? Why not? George left Massachusetts. He went into Mississippi. Hey, this is great, So I worked my way further back. And I found out George was the son of a man named Samuel Layton, who is the son of a Samuel Layton. And his father was my other patriot, who was from Gloucester, Massachusetts. And his wife was Esther Collins. Esther was the daughter of my patriot ancestor, James Collins. So that's kind of how it works its way backwards to them.
Did you ever find out more about why the family said, no, this is not acceptable to us?
I don't. I couldn't see a religious reason. I couldn't see a professional reason. I looked for news articles and I didn't come across them. I'm still holding my breath that maybe something will be out there, because I found it an interesting oral history to hear from my cousins in the South. But I don't think they pulled it out of thin air. So it's kind of, and it is just, it's really interesting to see people come from New England into Mississippi during one of the most, almost near the start of the Civil War, or just a couple decades before that. What were they looking for? What did they want? On my Moffat side, my grandfather's paternal line, that line goes back very quickly into Ireland. And as far as we know, James Moffat, my grandfather's father, was the son of a Thomas Moffat, who was the son of a James Moffat, who was the immigrant ancestor from Ireland. And he came into Mississippi from Ireland right smack dab, like near the Civil War. So it's like, why? What would compel him to do that?
When you said that you learned this from your cousins, were these white cousins?
Yes.
How did you connect with them? And tell me about that experience.
So on Ancestry, with the help of family trees, of course, that's usually how you're going to connect with other living descendants of your relatives, is the family trees. You see who else is out there researching. And I came across a tree of a cousin who wasn't very active, but then I reached out. He had 2 beautiful oil paintings, which are still in his possession, that he took pictures of. And these paintings were of George Layton and his wife, Sarah Ledbetter. So he sent me copies of those, which, pictures are like, I think that's the thing we all want, pictures and paintings. Like, well, I'm going to put a face with this name. So I was very appreciative of that. But not a whole lot beyond that. And it just, again, this was something that had been passed down to him. He shared it with me.
Did you end up meeting any of the cousins from the lines that you were researching from your Revolutionary War patriots? Did you meet any of your white cousins?
Well, yes.
Or relatives? And how did that happen?
Okay, so after I became a DAR member is when I met one of my cousins that is also a descendant of James Collins. And that cousin is also a DAR member, but did not know that she descended from James Collins. So until I came about and I connected with her, via DNA. Like she had been in my aunt's DNA results and another my uncle's results, and I had seen her tree out there, and we connected beyond George Layton. She comes from one of his daughters, and I come from another, so she has these Mississippi roots too. But I think she would have discovered this on her own, but she's just such a very busy lady. She never got around to it. But she, after I came and joined, she learned that, hey, I'm also a descendant of this patriot. Now, she was already a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and at the time we met, that was my first DAR conference experience. I flew out to Connecticut, where she was the state regent at the time, and we met there. And I spoke at their conference and shared about our connection to our patriot and how, even though we could see that on paper, this is what it could also look like using DNA. So that was what my conference experience was. And my first experience with DAR, I think I was only a few months in as a member. And so she was awesome. She's an awesome cousin.
What year was this?
I became a member in 2016, fall of 2017 or fall of 2016. Like I said, it was very, very rapid.
Why did you choose to reach out to her?
Just, I noticed in her tree that she had other patriot ancestors. She did not seem to have much information on this one. And like I said, I just think that might have been an oversight, but, hey, I'm here. I see you are a member of this organization. I just became a member under this patriot. That is your patriot too, and she did not realize that. She just never got around to, I guess, that particular line. So,
what happened when the two of you met and she found out that you were African American?
She that didn't surprise her or faze her. I think my profile picture on Ancestry is right there, so it's no secret when I'm writing or reaching out to people who I am or how I identify.
She is white and was the regent. The regent is the leader of the whole state of Connecticut, of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And here you are, African American, contacting her and telling her that you are a cousin of her ancestor who married into a slave-owning family, which family lore said that the rest of the family wrote him off because of that. Yet she decides to invite you to speak at the conference to the entire Connecticut state membership as her Black family member. How do you feel about this remarkable story?
It probably was a surprise for them. One of the questions you always get, I think, as a woman of color, daughter of color, is, or assumptions, is that your patriot is Black or African. And every time I meet a woman, they start off, not every time, but a lot of times I'll meet people and they'll start off with this, people don't know that there were African American individuals who fought in the war. And I let them go on for a little bit. And then I'll say, yeah, my patriot was European. So I think that's surprising for a lot of people, just wrapping their heads around that concept. And then it's, where did this racial mixing or whatever happen? And what does that look like? And what does that mean? The state regent is not African American, but I am. And that happened again with my grandfather. That's where that connected.
What was the reaction like from the women in the room?
Oh, it was very pleasant. I think they liked the presentation.
What was your presentation about?
It was about DNA. So it was about the I used this fun play. Our patriot was a commander of a privateer ship. So basically he was a pirate for the government. And I use this exploring like uncharted waters theme, navigating the DNA seas. How do you find your way with DNA back to or connecting with individuals. It's very complex. I don't want to say that the DNA that we share comes from our patriot ancestor, but as descendants, it could. There's still more work and investigating that needs to be done. So that was the presentation was about DNA matching collaboration and how you can use it to try to work your way backwards and determine who your ancestral connections are, or to use that to help you find more record sets, point you into the direction of which records you need to be looking at. So that was the presentation. It was just a very basic primer to, like, these are the types of DNA tests you could take. This is how I discovered her in my aunt's DNA test. But not just that, she only shares DNA with like two aunts and an uncle. So she doesn't share DNA with my mom. She doesn't share DNA with me. So there's the genetic heritage, and then there's the traditional paper trail heritage. So on paper, yeah, I'm totally connected, and even genetically or biologically, we're connected, but we just don't happen to share DNA. However, a point I was trying to drive home in the presentation was, if I hadn't attested additional relatives, I would have never known that she was of any, she shared any genetic connection with my family. So I was really just trying to drive home the point of, don't just stop with yourself, test other relatives. This is what it looks like. Now that we've tested here, what other information can we get from this? And third-party tools that you could use to find out, oh, this is the segment of DNA that we share, and finding other people who share on that. So it went from kind of a basics to a little bit advanced, but I tried to weave in storytelling about our patriots and our shared ancestors to kind of lighten it up a little bit.
Tell me about your patriots. What was their service for each of your patriots?
So as I mentioned, the patriot I came into the DAR in was Commander James Collins, and he was a commander of a privateer ship, and that ship was called the Cumberland, at which he apparently got lost at sea or never returned from sea from his service. So I don't know much about him beyond that afterwards, but prior to being a commander, he was also served in Moses Little's campaign as an officer of the Continental Line. But when I came along, for whatever reason, DAR did not accept that part of his service. So that is something that when I have more time, I want to investigate and see, if we can confirm that in fact. But what was interesting about his service, when I mentioned these little details, because I wrote a blog after I joined, and when I mentioned these little details about his service, an individual who's a member of the Society of the Cincinnati reached out to me, and he said, "Oh my gosh, I just read your story, and I see that your patriot may have been an officer in the Continental Line, and do you have any brothers that would be interested in joining the Cincinnati?" And I had never heard of this lineage organization, so I was like, I have a brother. I don't know much about the organization, but I will, once they shared the information with me, it's the oldest patriotic lineage organization, but for males only. I take that back. There is a women's segment, but for men who can prove descent from an officer who served in the Continental Line. And that, there are many different ways that you can prove patriot service. You can donate goods. You could be a signer of the Declaration of Independence. You could fight in a battle. You could serve at sea. So my being an officer was a big deal for many reasons. Not everybody could serve in that capacity. They decided that his service record looked as though he had been what they call deranged. And I learned that that's an 18th century word for, after he served with that regiment, we don't have a lot of work for you to do. So now just hang tight until we do have something else for you to do. And at that point, he ended up going on to becoming a commander of this privateer ship.
Was there anything in particular while you were researching Commander James Collins that really stood out to you personally?
Well, there was this letter that he is said to have written, and he's really telling the British off, or just talking about how poorly they've behaved in war. And so, if you don't mind, I'll read a little bit of that. But the letter is dated 23rd August, 1778. And he is writing to a William Grant, and the Cumberland, the ship that he had been on, had been off the Labrador coast of Canada. So it starts, here's the letter. Having taken a tour on the Labrador coast, I have visited several of your posts, and agreeable to the rules of war, the rule that Britain has adopted in the present savage war against America, have destroyed your works for the seal fishery, leaving the dwelling houses provisions and every necessary for the support of the poor who may occupy them, having no disposition to destroy poor innocent individuals. I hereby wish the subjects of the King of Britain had retained so much of the humanity they were formerly possessed with as to have proceeded in the same line of conduct. But alas, so far from that, they have not only burned the habitations of the poor and inoffensive inhabitants of America wherever it has been in their power, but have stripped the clothes of their backs in the most inclement season of the year. We abhor such savage-like proceedings and only aim at weakening the sinews of an unjust and cruel war wickedly commenced against America. And he goes on. I mean, and he's just really letting them have it. And what I liked about this letter is how he talks about humanity. And again, as the grandparent of George, who decided to take a different path outside of Massachusetts and go down into Mississippi and marry into this enslaved family, I like to believe that James would have afforded this humanity that he talks about to all people, because that is my personal struggle, I think, as a daughter of color. And like I said, as someone who has used genealogy to kind of overcome some generational shame or anger or whatnot towards these particular lines of my family history, is that I'd like to believe that at that time, if James Collins had it, if it was his decision, that people that looked like me and were African American or were enslaved would have been afforded that same humanity, and he would have done things differently, especially knowing or hearing that for some reason the family cut off his grandson when he went to Mississippi. So I don't know, it's just a hope, but it really, it also helped me to realize that each generation is on its, like, their own, George went and did something different than his grandfather, than what his parents did. And I like to look at them individually sometimes instead of as this direct family line that this is who they were as a people, because they change, generations change and their stories change a little bit.
What do you know about your other Patriot service, Samuel Layton?
As with James Collins, Samuel Layton was also from Gloucester, Massachusetts. And his father was a captain. We determined that he was probably in the welling industry.
You mentioned that your cousin encouraged you to join the DAR.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you decide to proceed and actually join the Daughters of the American Revolution?
I like challenges. And I thought to myself, well, if there's someone up for looking at my application, looking that, okay, we're going to need DNA analysis for this, and willing to see that I have a compelling case, then I'm all for it, especially if that means assisting other individuals who may have similar roadblocks in their application process. So at that time, the DAR only had a very strict DNA policy, and they only accepted Y DNA, and it had to, you'd have to have two individuals, males on a Y line, and it was my situation did not apply to that at all. But years before I had tried to join the DAR, I had been invested in taking or having my relatives take Y DNA test anyway. So my uncle had taken one. This is my mother's brother. And then I had a Moffat cousin in Mississippi take one, and he is my mother's half first cousin. So he is a white cousin, but he was one that had accepted my grandfather as his uncle. My grandfather had siblings that did not accept him as a sibling. The only two, I think, out of the four did or would acknowledge him. So this particular cousin did. He said, yeah, I know your grandfather. That's Uncle Bubba. That's what he called him. And he said, my dad, came a few times over, and my dad introduced us. So I was very fortunate. I'd asked him, if he would take a Y DNA test, because I was also working with a Moffat cousin in Canada. And that particular cousin I was working with, I had connected with on Ancestry as well. And what I had noticed at that time was that where my information stopped with the Moffat family in Mississippi, it picked up or ended in his family tree with the family coming out of Ireland into Mississippi. So it was like, okay, he I have the pieces he needs to come forward, and he has the pieces I need to go backwards. But I reached out to him and asked him a little bit about his sources and where he was getting that information. And he supplied a wealth of research he had done through trips to Ireland and visiting. And then when I told him, well, we're African-American people, but, and our last name is Wilson, but that's a fake last name. It really has no biological standing in our family. My grandfather's really supposed to be a Moffat. I think he was a little like, well, how do you know that for sure? And I said, well, there's this oral history. And then that's when we kind of got together and started to do this Y DNA project of ours. It was our own little Y DNA project. And again, this is prior to joining the DAR. So I had my uncle tested, and he matched our Moffat cousin in Canada. And then I said, well, let me get our cousin in Mississippi, our Moffat cousin in Mississippi tested. So he tested, and then he also matched. So this helped me to secure the connection between my mother's father's father and the rest of his biological heritage through that line. And when I joined the DAR with my application, I had to submit affidavits from my uncle and from my cousin in Mississippi who took the Y DNA test that this is what we understood to be true. We submitted their Y DNA test results to show that there was a close paternal family connection. And as I mentioned, with this particular patriot going up the Layton line, it was pretty straightforward after that, or from the Moffat, and then working our way back to the Layton line and the Collins line. So it really came down to finding a chapter and a registrar who would help with the application. And the chapter that I'm with now in Florida, the registrar at the time was fully willing and took it straight on. She took the DNA course and wrote up an amazing analysis to meet the DAR criteria for their applications. And at that time, she had stated, your application's causing quite a fuss or uproar or excitement, at national, because I think it was helping to highlight that there are more ways we can use DNA on applications if, there is substantial evidence to prove, whatever the roadblock may be, which in this case was my grandfather is the son of a James Moffat and not the Tom Wilson that's on his birth certificate. Not only that, another thing that I had to do with my application, or that was suggested by the registrar, was that I amend his death certificate. So my grandfather's death certificate was also incorrect. And my aunts, two of my mother's older sisters were the informants at the time of his death when he died. And they had stated his father was James Wilson or something. So you start seeing like versions of like partial truths. They didn't know who his dad was. They never met the man. I think he died in 1957. So they would have been children anyway. They probably wouldn't have remembered him even if they had met him. But the death certificate was incorrect. And with that, the registrar said, well, let's go ahead and amend that now that through DNA testing and you have this information from this cousin, you can correct the record. And so I did that. And
how did your family feel about correcting the record?
Well, they had to help. At that time, I had asked my aunts, since they were the original informants, if they could sign off on these amendment papers, and they did that. And I think that one of the aunts hated genealogy. She's no longer with us anymore, but the other aunt has always been, she kind of tuck some things in my hand and say, but we don't know anything about this. But she's giving it to me to say, like, but go find out. So it would be funny because she gave me the picture of my grandfather's father and said, this is the picture your grandfather had. And, he said it was his father, but we don't know anything about that. And so, but she knew I was going to go but go find out. So that was a funny thing. And nobody knows, and don't talk about this and this.
What type of emotions did it bring up becoming a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution and knowing that you descended from someone who did contribute to the founding of the United States of America after you reconciled the past pain from the relationship that your patriot had with the slave-owning family? Once you reconciled that, did anything change for you as far as knowing that you did descend from someone who fought for the independence of this country?
That is, it's interesting, being a daughter. And I like this question about emotion or feelings. I see a lot of times, pride, I'm very proud. I'm pride and just celebration and excitement. And for me, I would say it's just acceptance, taking ownership of this is who my family is, accepting it. I would not be here if I did not come through this individual, who was not perfect. I'm not perfect. My ancestors weren't. And giving myself permission to explore the history and the heritage, where I don't think we, as a family, my family really has given that, you learn this for yourself, so you're not always being told something about your history that's not necessarily true or applicable to your particular family story. So not being told, all Blacks or African American people were enslaved. Well, no, maybe I come from free people of color. Maybe there are Quakers in my ancestry. Maybe I have this patriot ancestor, which I found that many of those things are true. And so that's what I kind of use this for. I don't know that I've given myself the freedom to go as far as saying, I just think it's amazing. I find it so prideful,
If you are still, I guess, healing from the pain of the past, why would you go into an organization that has that history of excluding Black members?
I am not one to join a lot of organizations, and so I was a little hesitant about that, but I've been pleasantly surprised by how much I have enjoyed my short amount of time as a member, and some of the women I've met and being able to connect with them with shared interest beyond genealogy. I've really enjoyed that. And so if we're going to look at America and past racial discrimination and injustice, everywhere you turn, you're going to probably encounter that. And that is something, you accept and you say, well, today's a different day. And you try to move on from that, and you try to be a better, citizen than maybe some were in the past. I don't like to use, well, that's just the way it was back then, because as with the example of my ancestor George, something was not the way it was. Something was not okay with that family. So I trust that there were many other families like that. And I trust that there are many daughters out there that weren't like that, at that time and now.
What was your experience like when you first joined the chapter?
There are 5 DAR chapters in the area where I was living at the time, and I was initially put in touch with one chapter, but I ultimately decided on the chapter that I'm with now based off a schedule. So when I came to the meetings, and I came to a couple meetings before I actually became a member while the registrar was working on my application. So everybody was super friendly and nice. And our chapter has a chapter house that is under our care that has a historical cemetery attached to it. And so it didn't occur to me beforehand when I was planning on joining this chapter, any of the cemetery significance, or that I may even have a connection to it. So there is a pioneer family in the from the city of Sarasota, or that is considered a pioneer family for Sarasota, Manatee County, Florida. And the pioneer individual is buried in the cemetery, which is adjacent to the chapter house. And that cemetery is called the Whitaker family cemetery. And when I heard that name, when you hear names and you're connected to them somehow, they automatically like, oh, Whitaker. I know some Whitakers. And I remember I looked into it. I said, where are the Whitakers from? Where did they come from? And it turned out that William Henry Whitaker, who's buried there, is a third cousin to a man named John Whitaker. And John Whitaker was the enslaver of an ancestor of mine from Wilkinson County, Mississippi. John Whitaker enslaved my ancestor named Philip Branch. And our family had always believed that John was the half-brother of Philip, which would have made Philip a Whitaker. So at the time I was joining this chapter, I thought, if Philip Branch, my fourth great grandfather, is biologically a Whitaker, then everyone in this cemetery is going to be related to me. And that was just really odd to me, because as someone who was military, traveled around all my life, and not really having a connection to any one place that I had lived, where my father may have been stationed, to know that like I picked Sarasota as a place to live in for a few years, and then found the DAR, through my cousin, or fell into this whole process. And then this chapter that I ended up selecting would have all this history attached to it and connections to someone in my family. So as I was joining, though, this is not all chronological, but as I was joining, I told a cousin of mine, a branch cousin, who is a third cousin, I said, you've got to take a DNA test. Would you please take a DNA test for me? Because I need to know, we need to resolve this. Does our branch line connect to the Whitaker family out of North Carolina? And so he was gracious enough to take the test for me, a Y DNA test. And the results came back on my birthday. Like, yay. And so I got the results back. I opened them up. And as I was expecting to find Whitakers listed for his matches, I actually found a different surname, and he matched nothing but men with the last name Fletcher. And so I was a little bit surprised, but not wholly. If anything, I was just happy to have the truth. Okay, if we're not Whitakers and we're Fletchers, then that's okay. Like, I'm not related to everyone in the cemetery, but there still is this connection. And so the Fletchers, as I did my research on them, over time, I learned that they are a Quaker family out of the eastern part of North Carolina, in Perquimans County, North Carolina. But back to the Whitakers, yeah, I thought that was interesting. And what I especially thought was, what would my fourth great grandfather think if I was related to them? And even if I'm not, as I'm joining this women's organization, and he was enslaved by a Whitaker. So he had no choice but to work for the family. He had to do the work. Whereas me joining a service organization and potentially being involved with this chapter on a level which could incorporate my, taking care of the cemetery or doing a project involving it. And so to do that, in my free time, I thought that's such a privilege. And what would he think of that?
You mentioned that you've enjoyed your experience as a member. Have you been engaged in some of the committee work or volunteer work? Tell me about that.
Yeah. So after becoming a member and with two small children, I learned that there was the Children of the American Revolution. So my children became members of that organization in July 2017. And I try to be involve them in the activities. So the work that I do doesn't seem to take me away from the home or away from them. And I thought it would be a great way for them to learn American history and learn earlier on than I had about this information. And I'm really big on service. So I like the idea that they could be part of this patriotic lineage organization and give in service with different volunteer projects within their community at an early age. So I've been involved with the Children of the American Revolution as a member locally. I am a society president. I'm also the state chairman for the state of Florida for the Children of the American Revolution, and a second senior vice president for the state society Children of the American Revolution. So wearing a lot of CAR hats at this moment. And I have also been I am also serving right now as the national vice chairman for the DNA Network Committee. If you care to be social and want to get into the conversation, then you'll encounter me, and I do approvals and post about different DNA related material that mostly should help daughters with their DNA pursuits as it relates to applications and finding new patriots.
Why did you decide to take on leadership roles within the society?
Before I joined DAR, I didn't really know about how many service opportunities there were. So seeing that, I thought, well, great. I hadn't been volunteering for a while. And I thought, well, this is a great way to be involved in my community and to be involved with my children and to continue learning more about patriots and DNA. So I like that aspect of it.
Did becoming a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution change your life?
It has helped me to have a social network and group of women as friends. I've met a lot of women that are just awe-inspiring and just incredible